Nuremberg prison, cell 5, in a concrete corridor lit by bare bulbs that never dim. The guard on duty passes the cell door every 30 seconds, glancing through the observation slot at the man lying on the narrow cot, blanket pulled to his chest, eyes closed. Hermann Göring, former Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich, Hitler's designated successor, the man who built the Luftwaffe and founded the Gestapo, appears to be sleeping. His breathing is audible, steady. The guard moves on, boots echoing down the hallway. Outside, October rain taps against barred windows. In barely 2 hours, 10 convicted Nazi leaders will climb wooden steps to the gallows erected in the prison gymnasium. Göring's name heads the list, but for him, the countdown has already ended. Göring's name heads the list, but something in that cell is already shifting. A choice has been made. A glass capsule smaller than a lipstick tube lies somewhere within reach, filled with potassium cyanide, enough to kill a man in 3 minutes. The guard walks past again. Göring does not stir. At 10:44 p.m., Chaplain Gorecka makes his rounds up. He pauses at cell 5, peers inside. The figure on the cot has not moved. Gorecka continues down the corridor. 2 minutes later, a guard notices something wrong. The breathing sounds different, labored. He calls for the duty officer. When they open the cell door and reach the cot, Hermann Göring is convulsing, foam at the corners of his mouth, a bitter almond smell filling the small space. Glass fragments glitter on his lips. By 10:50 p.m., the prison doctor pronounces him dead. The man sentenced to hang has cheated the rope, and in doing so, he has created a mystery that will outlive everyone in that corridor. Because Hermann Göring was under constant surveillance. His cell was searched repeatedly. Every item he touched was inspected. Every visitor was monitored. Yet somehow, through 18 months of imprisonment, interrogation, and trial, he kept a cyanide capsule hidden, and he used it the one night it mattered most. The question that has never been fully answered is not whether he died by his own hand. The autopsy confirmed cyanide poisoning. Fragments of the glass vial were recovered from his mouth. The question is how. How did he obtain the capsule? How did he conceal it through countless searches? And who, if anyone, helped him? This is the story of the obscure death of Hermann Göring. Not obscure because it went unnoticed. The world's press reported it within hours, but obscure because the mechanism, the logistics, the precise chain of events that allowed it to happen remained disputed, incomplete, and in some ways deliberately obscured by those who were there. In this video, you're going to see exactly what happened in Cell 5 on the night of October 15th and what the evidence reveals about those final minutes. You'll see the 3 competing theories about how Göring obtained the cyanide and why none of them have been definitively proven. You'll see the security procedures at Nuremberg prison and the specific points where those procedures could have failed or been bypassed. You'll understand why Göring was so determined to avoid the noose and what the method of execution meant in terms of Nazi ideology and personal honor. You'll see the contents of the suicide note he left and what it claims about when he acquired the poison. And you'll see why his death, rather than satisfying the demand for justice, created a wound in the Nuremberg proceedings that has never fully closed. If detailed, document-driven investigations into World War II's final reckonings, the people who stood trial, and the moments that defined accountability are the history you're looking for, consider subscribing. And while you listen, think about this. When a condemned man chooses his own death over facing the sentence a tribunal imposes, does that represent a final act of defiance, or an admission of guilt too overwhelming to confront? Use the comments to share where you stand. Now, step back 2 decades from that cell. Long before Hermann Göring lay dying with cyanide on his tongue, he was a decorated fighter pilot in World War I, a recipient of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor, and a man whose courage in combat was unquestioned. Born in 1893 into a family with colonial and military ties, Göring joined the German Air Service in 1915 and quickly distinguished himself as a skilled and aggressive pilot. By war's end, he commanded the Jagdgeschwader 1, the fighter wing once led by the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Göring refused to comply with the armistice terms requiring surrender of aircraft. Instead, he ordered his squadron to fly to a German airfield, rather than hand the planes over to the Allies. That refusal to accept defeat, that insistence on dictating terms even in loss, would define the rest of his life. In the chaos of post-war Germany, Göring drifted. He worked briefly as a commercial pilot in Sweden, where he met and married a Swedish baroness, Karin von Kanso. In 1921, he returned to Munich and enrolled at the university. It was there, in 1922, that he attended a political rally and heard Adolf Hitler speak. Göring was captivated. He sought out Hitler afterward and offered his services to the fledgling Nazi party. Hitler, recognizing the propaganda value of a decorated war hero, accepted immediately. Göring became commander of the SA, the paramilitary brown shirts, and participated in the failed beer hall putsch of November 1923. During the attempted coup, Göring was shot in the groin. He fled Germany to avoid arrest and spent the next 4 years in exile, primarily in Sweden and Italy. During that time, he was treated with morphine for the wound and became addicted, a dependency that would plague him for decades. When the Nazis returned to power in the early 1930s, so did Göring. By 1933, he held multiple positions of immense authority. He was minister-president of Prussia, which gave him control over 2/3 of Germany's territory and police apparatus. He founded the Gestapo, the secret state police that would become synonymous with Nazi terror. And in 1935, Hitler appointed him commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, the rebuilt German Air Force that violated the Treaty of Versailles, but embodied Nazi ambitions. Göring threw himself into the role with manic energy. He oversaw the Luftwaffe's expansion from a clandestine project into one of the most formidable air forces in Europe. And he reveled in the trappings of power, elaborate uniforms, hunting estates, art collections looted from across occupied Europe, and a lifestyle of excess that became legendary even within the Nazi hierarchy. But power brought responsibility, and responsibility brought failure. The Luftwaffe's inability to defeat the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940 was the first major crack in Göring's reputation. Hitler began to turn to others for strategic advice. The failed attempt to supply the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad by air in 1942-43 further damaged Göring's standing. By the war's final years, he was increasingly sidelined, spending time at his estate, Carenhall, surrounded by stolen art while the Reich collapsed. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, Göring sent a telegram to Hitler suggesting he assume leadership, since Hitler was trapped in the bunker. Hitler interpreted this as treason, stripped Göring of all ranks and titles, and ordered his arrest. When British forces captured Göring in May 1945, he was no longer Hitler's heir. He was a disgraced officer, bloated from years of drug use and luxury, carrying a stash of paracodeine pills and still clinging to the delusion that he might negotiate with the Allies as a fellow military leader. That delusion shattered quickly. The Allies were not interested in negotiation. Göring was transferred to Nuremberg, imprisoned, and placed on a strict diet that eliminated his drug access. As withdrawal symptoms faded and his weight dropped, something else emerged: the sharp, combative intelligence that had made him effective in the 1930s. By the time the International Military Tribunal convened in November 1945, Göring had transformed himself into the de facto leader of the defendants. He sat in the front row of the dock, a position that reflected both his seniority and the prosecution's view that he was the most significant Nazi leader in custody. The trial that followed, which lasted nearly a year, placed Göring at the center of a legal and moral reckoning. He was charged with conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was staggering in scope. Documents bearing his signature authorizing the plunder of occupied territories, testimony linking him to the establishment of concentration camps, recordings of speeches in which he openly discussed eliminating Jews from German economic life, and his own admissions during interrogation that he had known about and supported many of the regime's policies. On the stand, Göring was defiant, treating the witness box like a final stage. He famously outmaneuvered the American chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, using his sharp wit and intimate knowledge of the Reich's machinery to frustrate the prosecution. For a brief moment, Göring seemed to be winning the battle of words, humbling Jackson in open court before the sheer weight of signed documents and atrocities finally anchored him to his crimes. The prosecution introduced orders, transcripts, and decrees that connected him directly to atrocities across Europe. When the verdicts were delivered on October 1st, 1946, Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts. The tribunal's judgment described him as the leading figure in implementing Nazi policies and noted his direct involvement in planning wars of aggression and establishing the apparatus of repression and murder. Then came the sentence, death by hanging. And that word, hanging, carried a significance that transcended the simple fact of execution. For a man who saw himself as a soldier, who had earned the pour le mérite, who believed his military service granted him a certain standing even in defeat, hanging was not merely death. It was humiliation. Under military tradition, officers condemned to death expected to face a firing squad, a soldier's death that acknowledged their former status. Hanging was the method reserved for common criminals, traitors, and war criminals whose crimes had stripped them of any claim to honor. Göring understood this distinction immediately. Within hours of the verdict, he petitioned the tribunal to commute his sentence to death by firing squad. His letter was formal, restrained, and explicit in its reasoning. He acknowledged the tribunal's authority to impose death, but argued that his record as a soldier entitled him to a different method. The petition was denied. The tribunal's response was unambiguous. The method of execution had been carefully chosen and would not be changed. That refusal set in motion the final act of Göring's life. If the Allies would not grant him a soldier's death, he would deny them the spectacle of his execution entirely. This is where the central mystery takes shape, because from the moment Göring entered Allied custody in May 1945 until his death in October 1946, he was never truly alone. American guards watched him constantly. His cell was searched, his belongings were inspected. Security at Nuremberg was designed specifically to prevent exactly what would happen: a high-profile defendant escaping justice through suicide. And yet, Göring succeeded. The capsule that killed him was not improvised, not acquired at the last minute through some sudden lapse in security. Evidence suggests he had access to cyanide throughout his imprisonment, possibly from the very beginning. That detail, the fact that he may have carried poison through 18 months of confinement, trial, and surveillance, is the fulcrum on which this entire story turns. It transforms his death from a simple suicide into a failure of security, a question of complicity, and a demonstration that even within the most controlled environment, determined individuals can preserve agency in ways that institutions cannot fully eliminate. The Allies wanted to project total control, to show that Nazi leaders had been rendered powerless. Göring's death proved otherwise. He dictated the terms of his exit, and in doing so, he denied the tribunal the closure it sought. But how? 3 primary theories have emerged over the decades, each with supporting evidence, each with significant gaps. The first theory holds that Göring hid the capsule in his cell from the beginning, concealing it in a container of skin cream or pomade that passed through initial searches because guards were looking for weapons and documents, not poison hidden in cosmetic products. Göring was known to have used various ointments and medications, and the theory suggests he transferred the capsule from container to container during the limited moments of privacy allowed during washing or toilet use. Proponents of this theory point to his confident demeanor throughout the trial, and his apparent lack of concern about the verdict, suggesting he always knew he had an escape route. The second theory is more troubling because it implies direct human assistance. Many historians point to Lieutenant Jack Wheelis, an American officer who had developed a rapport with Göring over their shared love of hunting. Wheelis had key access to the prison's luggage room where Göring's personal effects were stored, providing a plausible window for the capsule's retrieval. This theory sits alongside the later claim of Herbert Lee Stivers, a young guard who alleged he was tricked into delivering the poison. Whether through Wheelis's professional access or Stivers's naivety, the consensus remains: the wall of security had a human crack. The third theory points to Göring's extensive interactions with his defense team and suggests the capsule was passed during attorney-client meetings, moments when guards were required to maintain some distance to preserve legal privilege. Göring met regularly with his lawyer, Otto Stammer, and these meetings occurred in spaces where physical searches were less invasive. If someone within Göring's network on the outside had obtained the capsule and passed it to a lawyer or intermediary, those meetings would have provided the most plausible transfer point. However, no direct evidence has ever surfaced proving any attorney's involvement, and Stammer denied any knowledge of the suicide plan. Each theory has been investigated. Each remains unproven. What is not disputed is the result. On the night of October 15, 1946, Hermann Göring possessed a working cyanide capsule, and he used it with precise timing. The executions were scheduled to begin at 1:00 a.m. on October 16th. Göring died roughly 2 hours before he would have been taken from his cell. That timing was not accidental. He waited until the moment when reversal was impossible, when the scaffolding was already in place, when the executioner and witnesses were preparing, and then he acted. He denied the Allies their final piece of theater, the image of Hitler's successor dangling from a rope, and he left behind a note. The note, found in his cell after his body was removed, was brief and deliberate. Written in German, it stated that he had always possessed the cyanide capsule, that he had kept it hidden throughout his imprisonment, and that he chose this method of death over the humiliation of hanging. The note offered no specifics about where the capsule had been concealed or how he had avoided detection. It read less like a confession and more like a final assertion of control. You thought you had me. You never did. Whether the note's claim that he always possessed the capsule was literally true or a final piece of misdirection designed to maximize Allied embarrassment remains unknown. What the note did accomplish was to shift blame entirely onto the Americans. If Göring had possessed the capsule from the beginning, then every search had failed, every inspection had missed it, and the entire security apparatus at Nuremberg had been operating under an illusion of control. The American command reacted with fury and embarrassment. Colonel Burton Andrus, the commandant of the prison, faced immediate questioning about how such a failure could have occurred under his watch. Andrus had been rigorous, implementing procedures that included regular cell searches, inspections of all incoming materials, and constant guard observation. Yet all of that had been insufficient. An official investigation was launched within days, interviewing guards, examining logs, and attempting to trace any possible point of entry for the capsule. The investigation produced no definitive answers, only the humiliating conclusion that Göring had outmaneuvered them. The procedures at Nuremberg were not casual. Every defendant's cell was searched at irregular intervals, specifically to prevent the concealment of contraband. Guards rotated shifts to prevent any single officer from developing a relationship with prisoners that might lead to compromise. Mail was read, packages were inspected, and even the defendant's clothing was examined before and after court sessions. Göring himself was subjected to additional scrutiny because of his rank and personality. The Americans knew he was intelligent, manipulative, and resourceful. They knew he would attempt to control his fate if given any opportunity, and still he succeeded. One detail that emerged from the investigation was that Göring had been allowed to keep certain personal items in his cell, including toiletries and medications for various ailments. These items were inspected, but not chemically analyzed. A small brass container, roughly the size of a fountain pen cartridge, could easily be hidden inside a jar of cream, a tube of ointment, or the lining of a toiletry case. During moments when guards turned away, when Göring used the toilet, washed his face, or changed clothes, he would have had seconds to transfer the capsule from one hiding place to another. Over 18 months, those seconds accumulated into enough time to develop a system. The capsule was small enough to be concealed in his mouth if necessary, tucked into his cheek, held under his tongue. If a guard entered unexpectedly, Göring could swallow it temporarily or hide it in his hand. The poison would not activate unless the glass vial was crushed. That leads to another question that haunted investigators. Did Göring have multiple capsules, or just one? If he had always possessed only a single capsule, then he had been extraordinarily careful never to accidentally crush it during searches or transfers. But if he had multiple capsules, perhaps 2 or 3 obtained before his capture, then the risk of losing one during a search would have been acceptable. He only needed one to survive until the night it mattered. The autopsy revealed fragments consistent with a single glass vial, but that does not exclude the possibility that others had been discarded or remained hidden in his cell after his death. The pressure to use the capsule intensified in the weeks following the verdict. Göring's petition for a firing squad had been denied. His appeal for clemency had been rejected. The date of execution had been set. On October 15th, the gallows were erected in the prison gymnasium. Göring would have heard the construction, the hammering, the testing of the trapdoors, the voices of the execution team preparing the machinery that would kill him and 9 other condemned men. Everything was proceeding toward a singular event designed to serve as the final statement of Nuremberg justice, the public execution of the Nazi leadership. But Göring had spent his entire adult life maneuvering for advantage, and he saw one final move available. If he died before dawn, he would control the narrative. He would deny the Allies the photographs they wanted, the images of him standing on the gallows, the moment of the noose tightening. He would rob them of the symbolism. And he would ensure that historians would forever have to acknowledge that Hermann Göring chose his own death, that even at the end, the Nazi leadership retained enough agency to frustrate Allied intentions. So on the evening of October 15th, Göring went through his final routine. He received his last meal, spoke briefly with the chaplain who made rounds, and settled onto his cot. The guards noted nothing unusual. He appeared calm, perhaps resigned, but not agitated. This composure was itself a kind of performance. Göring knew what was coming, not the gallows, but his own chosen exit, and he had to maintain the facade long enough to reach the moment when intervention would be impossible. Late that evening, in a gap between guard observations, Hermann Göring retrieved the capsule from wherever he had kept it hidden during those final hours. He may have carried it in his mouth already, waiting for the right moment. He may have taken it from a final hiding place in his clothing or bedding. What is certain is that he bit down on the glass vial, crushing it, releasing the potassium cyanide into his mouth and throat. Cyanide works by blocking the body's ability to use oxygen. Cells suffocate even as the lungs continue to draw breath. The victim convulses, consciousness fades, and death follows within minutes. For Göring, it would have been faster than the noose, if not painless. When Chaplain Gericke passed the cell during his rounds, he saw nothing that alarmed him. But shortly after, the sounds from cell 5 changed. A guard heard labored breathing, a rattling gasp that did not match normal sleep. He approached the observation slot, looked inside, and saw Göring's body jerking, foam appearing at his mouth. The guard shouted for assistance. The cell door was unlocked. By the time the prison doctor arrived, Göring's body was already cooling. The smell of bitter almonds, characteristic of cyanide poisoning, filled the small space. Glass fragments were visible on his lips. A crumpled note lay on the small table beside his cot. The doctor pronounced him dead just hours before he was scheduled to hang. Within minutes, news of the suicide reached Colonel Andrus, the tribunal officials, and eventually the Allied command. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some saw it as a final act of cowardice, Göring running from the judgment he deserved. Others recognized it as a calculated maneuver, a last assertion of control that denied the Allies their desired conclusion. The 10 other condemned men, waiting in nearby cells for the executions that would proceed without Göring, learned of his death before dawn. Some reportedly expressed envy. Göring had escaped the humiliation they would face on the gallows. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the executions began in the prison gymnasium. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was the first to climb the gallows. Wilhelm Keitel, Field Marshal and Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, followed. One by one, the condemned men were led from their cells, up the 13 steps and through the trapdoor. The hangings were deliberately botched. The drops were too short, the ropes too long, and several men died slowly, strangling rather than having their necks broken cleanly. Some took more than 20 minutes to die. It was brutal, chaotic, and far from the dignified process of justice the tribunal had envisioned. And through it all, Hermann Göring's empty cell stood as a rebuke to the entire proceeding. Göring's body was photographed, autopsied, and then cremated, along with the other executed Nazis. Their ashes were scattered in a river, ensuring no grave could become a shrine. But the absence of Göring from the gallows photographs, the gap where the highest-ranking defendant should have been, remains visible in every historical account of that night. The Nuremberg executions are remembered not just for the 10 men who died, but for the one man who refused to participate. In the days following the suicide, the American investigation intensified. Guards were interrogated. Herbert Lee Stivers, the young American soldier who later claimed he had unwittingly helped Göring, was questioned but not charged. The brass container Göring had allegedly used to hide the capsule was never definitively identified. Some reports suggested it was found in his belongings, others that it was never recovered at all. The truth dissolved into competing narratives, each plausible, none provable. What emerged from the investigation was not clarity but a catalog of possibilities, each revealing how even the most controlled system contains vulnerabilities. The psychological dimension added another layer. Göring had been interviewed extensively by Allied psychiatrists and intelligence officers during his imprisonment, including Dr. Gustave Gilbert, the prison psychologist who had regular access to all defendants. Gilbert's notes reveal that Göring frequently spoke about honor, military tradition, and the importance of controlling one's fate. He expressed contempt for those who broke under pressure and admiration for those who maintained composure regardless of circumstances. In hindsight, these conversations read like preparations, Göring signaling his intentions without being explicit enough to trigger preventive action. Gilbert later wrote that Göring had always maintained a certain emotional distance from the trial's outcome, as if the verdict were predetermined and irrelevant to his personal calculus. Other defendants showed visible anxiety as the verdicts approached, but Göring remained almost theatrically confident. That confidence was not denial. It was certainty. He knew he had an escape route. The only question was when to use it. His decision to wait until the night before execution, rather than taking the capsule immediately after sentencing, suggests he wanted to extract maximum symbolic value from his death. If he had died in October after the verdict, it might have been dismissed as an immediate emotional reaction, despair, or panic. By waiting until the scaffolding was built, until every procedural step had been completed, until the executions were hours away, he ensured his suicide would be interpreted as a deliberate repudiation of Allied authority. And that is exactly how it was received. Newspaper headlines around the world announced Göring's death with a mixture of outrage and grudging acknowledgement that he had outmaneuvered his captors. Editorial writers debated whether his suicide represented cowardice or courage, evasion or defiance. Nazi sympathizers, still scattered across Germany and abroad, seized on it as proof that the regime's leaders had not been truly defeated, that even in captivity they retained the will to dictate terms. For the prosecutors and judges at Nuremberg, the suicide was a professional and symbolic failure that overshadowed the successful executions of the other 10 defendants. The broader implications went beyond embarrassment. Nuremberg was designed to establish a precedent that individuals, regardless of rank or state authority, could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The trials were meant to demonstrate that law, not vengeance, would govern the post-war order. Göring's suicide undermined that narrative by showing that even under maximum security, even with the full resources of the Allied occupation, the rule of law could be circumvented by a determined individual with a glass capsule. It suggested that accountability was incomplete, that the architects of atrocity could still choose their exits, and that justice remained contingent on cooperation or failure rather than inevitability. For historians studying the Nuremberg trials, Göring's death remains a focal point precisely because it is unresolved. The 3 theories about how he obtained the capsule, concealment from the beginning, smuggling by an accomplice, or transfer through legal meetings, each imply different failures in the system. If he hid it from the start, then the initial searches when he was captured were inadequate. If someone smuggled it to him, then Allied security was penetrated by bribery, sympathy, or manipulation. If it was passed during attorney meetings, then the legal protections designed to ensure fair trials created exploitable gaps. None of these possibilities is comforting, and the lack of definitive proof means the vulnerability remains theoretical and unremedied. The note Göring left has been analyzed extensively. Its brevity and lack of detail were almost certainly intentional. By claiming he always had the capsule without explaining how or where he concealed it, Göring maximized uncertainty and forced investigators to question every aspect of their procedures without being able to identify a specific point of failure. The note also served to protect anyone who might have helped him. If no accomplice was named, no one could be prosecuted. Whether that was an act of loyalty or simply a final strategic calculation to preserve ambiguity is unknowable. Decades later, when Herbert Lee Stivers came forward with his claim that he had unknowingly delivered the capsule after being befriended by Göring and approached by a German woman, his account added detail but not certainty. Stivers described being given a small brass container and told it held medicine or a personal keepsake, something Göring wanted for sentimental reasons. He said he passed it to Göring during a moment when supervision was lax. But Stivers' story emerged years after the fact. His memory was inconsistent on specific dates, and no corroborating evidence was ever found. It remains one possible explanation among several, credible enough to be repeated in histories but never proven beyond doubt. What cannot be disputed is the outcome. Hermann Göring died on his own terms. He avoided the noose, preserved his self-image as a soldier rather than a criminal, and created a mystery that ensured his death would be remembered and debated long after the other executions faded into historical footnote. In that sense, his final act succeeded. He took control of a narrative that had been written by others for 18 months, and he rewrote the ending. The 10 men who did climb the gallows faced a different fate entirely. When guards came to their cells in the early morning darkness of October 16th, they were told that Göring was dead. The reactions varied. Some defendants reportedly showed relief that they would not have to share the scaffold with him, freed from his domineering presence, even in death. Others expressed frustration or envy that Göring had found a way out while they had not. Julius Streicher, the virulently anti-Semitic publisher of Der Stürmer, was defiant to the end, shouting Nazi slogans as he was led to the gallows. Wilhelm Keitel maintained military bearing, walking stiffly up the steps. Alfred Jodl, the operations chief, showed no emotion. Each man died in turn, some quickly, others struggling for long minutes as the poorly calibrated drops failed to break their necks cleanly. The executioner was Master Sergeant John C. Woods, an American military hangman whose competence has been questioned by historians. Whether the botched executions were the result of inexperience, deliberate cruelty, or simple miscalculation remains debated. What is certain is that the deaths were far from the clean, procedural justice the tribunal had envisioned. They were messy, prolonged, and in some cases agonizing. Witnesses described hearing choking sounds, seeing bodies twitch and convulse, watching men die slowly. The contrast with Göring's swift death by cyanide was stark. He had chosen a faster, more certain method, and in doing so had avoided not just the symbolism of hanging, but the physical degradation that came with it. The photographs taken after the executions show the bodies of the 10 men laid out in wooden coffins, their faces visible, necks marked by rope burns. But the photograph of Göring is different. He lies on his prison cot, his face slack, the glass fragments still visible on his lips, looking almost peaceful compared to the distorted features of those who hanged. That visual difference reinforced the narrative Göring had created. Even in death, he was separate, distinct, operating by rules the others could not access. The cremation of all 11 bodies happened quickly. The Allies wanted no shrines, no burial sites that could become pilgrimage points for Nazi sympathizers. The ashes were scattered in the Isar River, mixed together so that Göring's remains were indistinguishable from those of the men he had once commanded. It was a deliberate erasure, an attempt to deny the executed any physical legacy. But the obscurity of Göring's death, the unresolved questions surrounding it, proved more durable than any grave marker could have been. In the months and years following Nuremberg, the security failure that allowed Göring's suicide influenced how subsequent war crimes trials were conducted. When Adolf Eichmann was captured in Argentina and brought to Jerusalem for trial in 1961, Israeli authorities implemented far more stringent measures. Eichmann was kept in a bulletproof glass booth, his cell was under constant camera surveillance, and every item he touched was exhaustively inspected. The lessons of Göring's death had been absorbed. No defendant of that magnitude would be allowed to escape justice through suicide again. Eichmann was hanged in 1962, and his body was cremated and scattered at sea, following the precedent set at Nuremberg, but without the security failure that had marred it. The psychological impact on the prosecutors and judges at Nuremberg was profound. They had built a meticulous legal case, documented crimes in exhaustive detail, and secured convictions that many observers thought impossible. Yet Göring's suicide left them with a sense of incompletion. Justice Telford Taylor, who served as chief counsel for war crimes prosecutions, later wrote that Göring's death represented a theft, not just of the execution itself, but of the moral clarity that public accountability was meant to provide. The tribunal had wanted the world to see that Nazi leaders could not escape consequences. Göring had demonstrated that with enough determination and a small enough piece of contraband, they could. For the German population watching these events unfold, Göring's suicide carried complex meanings. To some, particularly those who had supported the Nazi regime, it was a final act of defiance that proved the party's leaders had not been broken by their captors. To others, especially victims of Nazi persecution and Germans who had opposed the regime, it was a cowardly escape from justice, a refusal to face the full weight of guilt. These competing interpretations reflected the deeper divisions in post-war Germany, where questions of responsibility, complicity, and accountability would remain contested for decades. The mystery of how Göring obtained the cyanide also fed into conspiracy theories that persisted long after the event. Some claimed the Allies had deliberately allowed his suicide to avoid the complications of a lengthy execution process. Others suggested that Göring had been murdered and the suicide staged to conceal Allied involvement. These theories were never supported by credible evidence, but they thrived in the information vacuum created by the incomplete investigation. When authorities cannot provide definitive answers, speculation fills the gap, and in Göring's case, that speculation has never fully subsided. Return now to that cell on October 15th, the bare bulb, the narrow cot, the guard walking past in the corridor outside. The man lying there with a capsule hidden somewhere within reach is not sleeping. He is waiting. Waiting for the moment when the timing is right, when intervention is impossible, when the machinery of justice is so far committed that his death will cause maximum disruption. And when that moment arrives, he acts. The glass breaks between his teeth. The cyanide floods his system. Within minutes, Hermann Göring is beyond the reach of any tribunal, any rope, any judgment except history's. The obscurity of his death lies not in the fact that it happened, but in the mechanics that allowed it. How did he keep the poison through 18 months of captivity? Who, if anyone, helped him? And why did a system designed to prevent exactly this outcome fail so completely? Those questions remain unresolved, and perhaps that is fitting, because the story of Hermann Göring's death is ultimately about the limits of control, the persistence of individual agency, even within total institutions, and the uncomfortable truth that accountability, no matter how carefully constructed, can still be refused by those determined enough to pay the final price. If this deep examination of the unanswered questions surrounding Nuremberg, the men who faced judgment and the moments where justice met resistance, is the history you want to explore further, subscribe for more documentary investigations into World War II's final chapters. And as you reflect on what you've heard, consider this. When a condemned man successfully evades the sentence imposed on him through suicide, does that represent a failure of justice? Or does it reveal that justice itself has limits that even the most rigorous systems cannot fully overcome? Share your perspective in the comments. The capsule that killed Hermann Göring was never fully accounted for. The method by which it reached his hand remains obscure, but the result was absolute. On the morning of October 16, 1946, 10 men climbed the gallows at Nuremberg. The 11th, the highest ranking, the one who should have been first, was already dead, his body cold, his final act complete. Justice was served, but not in the way the tribunal intended. And in that gap between intention and outcome lies the enduring mystery of Hermann Göring's obscure death. So here's the question I want you to think about. Which of the three theories do you find most convincing? Do you believe Göring hid the capsule from day one through sheer cunning and willpower? That someone on the inside, a guard, a sympathizer, or even his lawyer, smuggled it to him out of misplaced loyalty or bribery? Or is there another explanation we haven't considered? Some angle the investigators missed in 1946 that makes sense now with decades of hindsight? Drop your theory in the comments below. I read everyone, and the best analyses often come from viewers who see patterns the official investigations overlooked. If you want more deep dives into the Nuremberg trials, the documents that convicted Nazi leaders, and the moments when justice faced its greatest tests, hit that subscribe button. There's an entire archive of stories from this period that deserve the same documentary treatment. Cases where a single memo, a hidden detail, or an unanswered question changed how we understand history. I'll see you in the next one.